Before its decline in relevance becomes too severe, I suppose I should talk about Rainbow Six Siege. Siege is a 2015 tactical first-person shooter from the frog-fucking surrender monkeys at Ubisoft, and that was very nearly the end of the story because you see, I bought this game on release due to the recommendation of a friend of mine and his pet chimp, but that is a very rare story. No one bought this shit. It had an almost fake advertising level of trailer, and all in all people were, rightfully, looking at it like it was a cash grab intended to capitalise on the success of games like CSGO at the time. And with the Rainbow Six name slapped on it for market appeal, it certainly seemed like no one was very interested. And frankly, at the time, the game was, well, it was certainly fun. It had its player base, which you would see every 4 games. But really all it had was a core idea that people really wished was fleshed out more. And that kind of felt like the end of it, because most games in that state stay around for a bit, then die their inevitable death like the hamster you had when you were 9, but something miraculous happened. Rather than push this game off into the abyss like corporations tend to do with products that don't make money they expected, Ubisoft descended from the heavens to extend their hand to this game and pull it into the light. And that is how the game became the hero shooter salt mine that it is today, and why it pulls in at least B-tier success as far as games as a service models go. Prior to deciding to make this video, I hadn't actually played the game in a number of months, so it's been...
Left-hand corridor, I think, Mike. You know the new one. Oh my god!
a learning experience, I suppose. In Siege, you'll be playing one of 3 main game types: Bomb, Secure Area, and Hostage. In Bomb, there's a bomb for the attackers to defuse, in Secure, there's a room to hold, and in Hostage, well, no one actually plays Hostage, so no one knows. Every game type is a 5 vs 5 team objective where rounds are won through straight eliminations rather than objectives most of the time. Each team gets to choose operators, which are just your typical hero shooter affair nowadays, like a fucked MOBA with guns. At release, there were 20 operators, all who had their own flair, but were relatively tame. For example, you had Sledge, who has a sledgehammer, Capcan, who has tripwires, and Castle, who has the N-word pass. But 3 or so years on, we have 46 going on 48 or so operators, and now we have more unique offerings, such as Finka, who has nanomachines in her blood and a bone-thinning disease, Vigil, who doesn't remember much of his childhood, only that his family was escaping across Asia as refugees. Or were they criminals? He remembers his older brother drowning during a river crossing. He remembers the safe house where they stayed trapped for over a month in near silence. He remembers the train ride when the soldiers arrested 2 fellow defectors. He remembers his sick mother slowing them down all the way through the jungle crossing. He remembers leaving her behind as his father told him not to cry, not to make a noise and alert the armed patrols. And Buck, whomst have a shotgun on his gun. Many people take issue with the place the game has gotten to in this regard. They say it ruins immersion or breaks the game's original, more realistic theme. Personally, I don't really mind. Yeah, back in the day I enjoyed the game the way it was, but we were going to run out of realistic ideas and had holograms sooner or later. I think that the additions to the gameplay sandbox are ultimately positive. The operators are really the backbone of the whole game, and the constant introduction of new operators and rebalancing of classics tends to keep the meta shifting wildly about in a pretty interesting way. There are examples of operators like Mirror coming into the game and essentially changing the entire concept of how the game is even played. Suddenly we went from not having this operator to having an operator that, for a time, the entire defensive lineup would revolve around. Of course, this will bring up the question of balance, since every game where there's a roster of characters to pick from will have conversations about balance going on at literally any time. So I'm now going to say something that may deeply offend many people, so brace yourselves. As far as these kinds of game go, Siege is pretty well balanced. It isn't always balanced, but there's always an ongoing effort being made to keep the game in a more playable state. And for the most part, the operators themselves are all usable, and I think the reasoning for all that comes down to the gunplay and the general structure of the game. The gunplay has a huge impact on the softening of the power curve. It's been through some changes over the years, but mostly stayed in that low recoil, spray like a piss after you've jacked off kind of area, and most of an operator's weaknesses don't matter all that much, since if you get shot in the head... There he is. You're a corpse. It's funny to think about how one-hit headshot mechanic has affected the way the game plays, mostly in regards to the speed of rounds and firefights. The developers weirdly never intended for this mechanic to be so important to the core of the game, and as such the game plays very differently to that original idea they may have had. In fact, early on they introduced an operator whose ability was essentially to be immune to headshots, and he has stayed in a point of discussion ever since. He now only survives the one-shot to the front, and even that still often feels like too much in this game. The structure of a match plays out in the way you typically expect from any shooter of this type. You take turns attacking and defending an objective in a best of however many rounds, until one team is declared the victor, and the other team can get nice and racist.
I'm gonna say the N-word!
No, stop.
This helps in some way towards balancing, but no matter how many rounds you play, one team will always get an extra round on whichever side is feeling particularly broken this week. Siege has a pretty wide selection of maps that range from god-tier FPS royalty to utterly abysmal garbage with a TripAdvisor recommendation from the Satanic Church. The thing about the maps is that, dependent on which objective the team is defending, the whole focus of a round is shifted. A round in which someone is defending the kitchen on Chalet, for example, plays very differently to a round in which someone is defending Snowmobile. The placement of defenders and defences throughout the map, and the movement of attackers both around and inside the building, differ so greatly that even though you're on the same map, individual rounds have a completely different style of play. I think this is an underappreciated facet of the game, and contributes to the game's longevity in a way that many games of this type lack. Having the level of variety within individual matches themselves keeps the game fresh. The map selection is ever expanding in some way, whether it's through the game's sort of games as a service model, adding maps every new season, or perhaps providing a full rework of older maps. But being a games as a service type deal, you know that the game has to make its money somewhere. Back in my day, we had to pay for every operator in the game with either in-game currency or through the dreaded microtransactions, but that always felt pretty reasonable until the DLC season started rocking around with price tags steeper than Nigel Farage's dry cleaning. These days, for the deluxe edition buyers, the base game operators are unlocked by default, but everyone has to work to get the newer, shinier boys. And frankly, most people just drop the 30 quid a year on the season pass because otherwise the game can almost feel like a free-to-play grind with cosmetic purchases dangled in front of your face to get you to waste money on something other than operators. It's not great, but it's better than some. And well, we've come to that part of the video. You can't talk about a game like this without talking about
the community.
Back when you would bump into the same 5 fellas every 20 minutes and everyone was just learning how the game even worked, the community was actually made up of a group of people just having fun and talking shit. But nowadays I feel like arguing with teenagers over the internet is almost a game mechanic. I remember unironically being called a soy boy once, and personally I found it hilarious, but maybe you won't. If you're new to the game, there's a very low likelihood that anyone will accommodate you in any way. You're likely to be berated and team killed and kicked for your first 50 or so hours because the only way this game's community is going to teach you anything is by ostracizing you for not knowing it. Thankfully, I believe this game is a lot easier to learn than most people make out. I feel many people see shit like this and imagine they would rather get the shit smacked out of them by Vasily Kamansky than ever decide to learn the ins and outs of this game. But I think that frankly, between the guides and just playing the game and dying to a bit of bullshit, you can pick it up on a base level enough to find it fun. The other aspects of this game's community is of course the game at large, which is thankfully much less of a gas explosion than the in-game interactions would lead you to believe. With places like the game's subreddit, the shitposting subreddit, and the wide YouTube community, which includes all manner of smaller communities for you to attach onto like a blood-sucking parasite, Siege also has an active and somewhat interesting esports scene, which I don't really watch much of, so I have less than nothing to say about it. I'd consider Siege to be in that kind of A-tier multiplayer shooters, in that there are absolutely things that I have always vastly preferred over it, but within the modern sphere of, frankly, as far as my preferences go, less enjoyable shooters, I would consider it to be one of the better offerings out there. And if you've got some extra money lying about in your pocket, then it's the second best place you could put it. You know, other than sending it to me. I give it a coin out of 10.
Locate the biohazard.
Welcome back to the Kart cast, because we can't call it the Cunt cast. That's the name of my podcast, that's what I've decided. I said this the other night to Chandler and Keenan. Because you can't call it the Cunt cast, so you just call it the Kart cast. So you open up by saying, welcome back to the Kant cast, because we can't call it the Cunt cast.
But Mike, what if you had Calfcast on the Kart cast?
Welcome back to the Kant cast, because we can't call it the Cunt cast, featuring the Calf cast.